In the deep and shadowed ages, long before the Erdtree cast its golden light upon the world, the very stones of reality were witness to a conflict that would define an epoch. This was a time of primordial forces, of a world still simmering with the raw, untamed energies of the Crucible. In this forgotten era, the Elden Lord Placidusax, a being of living stone and timeless order, was challenged by a creature of fire and flesh, the dragon Bayle. Bayle was a paradox, a dragon who lacked the very stone scales that made his kin immortal, yet possessed a spirit that burned with a fury the undying could never comprehend. And so they fought, in a storm of mutual hatred that was more than a mere duel. It was a clash of philosophies, a war between two fundamental states of being. It was flesh against stone, mortality against eternity, and the echoes of that cataclysmic battle, I have come to believe, still resonate in the very soul of the lands between. The arrival of Bayle the Dread filled a gap in the lore that I have long sensed, but perhaps had not been able to put my finger on. With his story, so much more of the deep history of the dragons finally fits into place. The lingering questions that have always surrounded dragon communion and the ancient dragon cult, how dragons could take human form, and who dealt the grievous wounds on Placidusax's colossal body, all of it now begins to make a terrible, beautiful sense. And yet, for all that has been revealed, there are still fascinating details regarding the dragons that need to be ironed out, with new mysteries and stories to be unpacked. To do so, we must first understand the world that birthed these titans. I believe a good place to start this exploration is by talking about the Primordial Crucible, because I think it has everything to do with the story of Placidusax and Bayle. What was the Crucible? The aspects of the Crucible describe it as a place, or perhaps a state of being where all life was once blended together in a magnificent, chaotic soup. Ordovis's greatsword tells us that the primordial gold of this era had a red tint, a color that exemplifies the very nature of primordial life itself. This primordial matter, as it's called in the Gilded Great Shield description, would eventually go on to coalesce and become the Erdtree. But this always presented a puzzle to me. If the Crucible existed at the beginning of life on this world, long before the Elden Ring, then how could it have traces of gold? Shouldn't the gold have come from the Elden Ring, which we know arrived later? It was a contradiction that didn't make sense. But now, with new revelations, I think I finally understand. Count Ymir brought us the stunning truth that life itself was created in a cosmic rupture of the Greater Will long, long ago. We know that the Greater Will has gold as its divine aspect, and so it is that I now believe gold is an innate, fundamental part of the primordial matter of the world. It was present even before the Elden Ring made landfall and put its roots into the Crucible. So, all of this is to say that I am now convinced the ancient dragons were some of the earliest and most magnificent beings born from this primordial soup. They embodied many aspects of the Crucible, after all, the horn, the tail, the fiery breath, the wing, and the fang. So when Matter, the mother of fingers, arrived on this world to scout things out, I think the ancient dragons might have been the earliest and most obvious candidates for lordship. Then, the Elden Ring was sent down in the form of the Elden Beast, riding upon a golden star. And with that, I believe these ancient beings of the Crucible were granted the concept of order. We must remember that the Elden Beast is the living incarnation of the concept of order itself. And incidentally, the Elden Beast's internal name in the game's files is Nebula Dragon, and it does, to my eye, somewhat resemble an ancient dragon. It even spews the same golden breath that Placidusax does. Of course, these things could be just a coincidence, but what if they're not? What if the Elden Beast's very form was chosen as a strategic act of cosmic diplomacy, a way to ensure that this vassal beast and the alien concept of order would be accepted by the ancient, godlike dragons who already ruled the world? That's a fun thought, I think. Whatever the case, we learn from the remembrance of the Dragon Lord that Placidusax was indeed chosen as Elden Lord. But the question remains, who was his god, the vessel of the Elden Ring in that age? Was it actually the Elden Beast itself? Or more likely, I think, did he have a god equivalent to Marika, an individual who chose him as Elden Lord in the first place? In the end, we just don't know. All we know for certain is that something went catastrophically wrong with Placidusax's order, and his god eventually fled, leaving the Dragon Lord waiting endlessly in his throne beyond time for their return. Whoever they were, it's possible that this god was also an Empyrean, a valid candidate for godhood, and like the other Empyreans we know of, it's possible that Placidusax's god was also chosen by the Fingers. And that idea makes me wonder if Metter, the Mother of Fingers, held any influence in this Dragon Age. The main reference to fingers in this era comes from the Cinquidia, a 5-fingered dagger wielded by the high-ranking clergyman of Farum Azula who served the dragons. The Cinquidia celebrates a beast's 5 fingers, which were symbolic of the intelligence granted upon their kind. Now, this description doesn't mention who or what granted the beast's intelligence, but in an older version of this description, it did. Back in version 1.0 of the game, it was said to be the Greater Will that granted the beast's intelligence. So this mention of the Greater Will was deliberately removed by FromSoftware, and yet it makes perfect sense that the Greater Will would bestow intelligence upon the beasts, considering Placidusax was its Elden Lord at the time. So here's my theory on why it was removed. What if FromSoftware removed this mention of the Greater Will because they wanted to keep the lore a little bit more open-ended? What if they wanted to leave room down the line for another character who might have been capable of bestowing intelligence on behalf of the Greater Will? This is just an idea, but what if it was Metter who granted intelligence to the beasts through the power of her fingers? But however it happened, the beasts did gain intelligence. And a really great, poignant line on that topic comes to us from the description of bestial vitality, which reads, "Having gained intelligence, the beasts must have felt how their wildness slipped away as civilization took hold." The way this last line is worded is so strangely sad. I feel like it highlights that while something was being gained here, a crucial part of the beast's nature was being lost as well. Order had taken their wildness away, and just like with the aspects of the Crucible, such wildness and chaos would one day be looked back upon with scorn. But as we know from characters like Godfrey, the chains of order can be thrown off and wildness can be embraced. Just so, aspects of the Crucible can persist, even if they are suppressed. For these horns, feathers, and fangs, according to the new lore, are interminable evolutionary gifts and symbols of primacy, seemingly baked into the very DNA of all life born from the Crucible. This is why I think that at certain points in history, the Crucible of life would randomly throw a curveball into the mix, a wild card that challenges the established order. In the Golden Age of the Erdtree, it was the Omen and the Misbegotten. And in the Golden Age of the Ancient Dragons, I'd like to propose that this curveball was Bayle the Dread. A good place to start this part of the video is by talking about Bayle's betrayal and how his actions split the Dragon Brood in two. However, I want to keep this video focused on the DLC-related lore. In one of Smottown's video, he relates Placidusax to Tiamat, a goddess in Mesopotamian mythology who is associated with the primordial chaos of creation, and in Dungeons & Dragons, she has been transformed into the god of dragons, a 5-headed beast that very much resembled Placidusax. In trying to guess who wounded Placidusax, we could find the answer in Tiamat's myth, who herself warred upon her own children, and thus that one of Placidusax's children wounded him. Another dragon, one of his own brood.
In a time long past, Bayle turned upon the Dragon Lord. The foul traitor assailed our master and inflicted a grievous wound, only to make a hasty retreat, becoming a sworn enemy of the brood. Since that day, Bayle and his bloodline, the Drakes, have served as sacrifices for Dragon Communion. Land-bound warrior, my lord Placidusax has shown your kind what must be done. Seek communion. Sate your boundless appetite. Feel the euphoria of a dragon's essence taking root in your meager frame.
And I first want to start with Florisax's use of the word traitor, which means that Bayle once belonged to the ancient dragon brood. Given the word traitor means someone who has betrayed a cause or group, and in this case, a species, Bayle must have lived amongst the ancient dragons. And to me, Bayle is an evolutionary crossroads between the ancient dragons and those who had become his brood, the modern drakes. Florisax gives us some more interesting details regarding Bayle and his descendants, as she says, "Now seek the Jagged Peak. There you will find Bayle, the oldest and vilest of all dragons. Since that day, Bayle and his bloodline, the drakes, have served as sacrifices for dragon communion. Bayle is the oldest of the drakes, and they are his bloodline. And again, I therefore believe that Bayle was essentially counted among the ancient dragons whilst also representing something new, and every drake that followed would claim Bayle as their ancestor, with each generation moving further and further away from their ancient dragon ancestors until they became something else altogether, more animalistic and lacking the gravelstone scales of immortality. Yet, as I've said, Bayle himself is half and half between an ancient dragon and a drake in an evolutionary sense, and I believe he would have been considered as an ancient dragon by his kin. It's just that he is the start of a new evolutionary divergence. He is able to wield lightning, a power we associate with ancient dragons, not usually with his modern dragon descendants. Indeed, reinforcing the fact that it is ancient dragons who wield the red lightning is the description of red fulgur bloom, which reads, "Found at the Jagged Peak on the south coast, said to bloom where the red lightning of the ancient dragons strikes the earth. This is no mere passing skill as well, for Bayle's mastery of the lightning is only exceeded by the likes of Placidusax or Fortisax. A wounded Bayle is able to use his mastery over lightning to produce lightning wings that act as a sort of prosthetic to his ruined wings. My reason for believing that these fake wings are a sort of lightning incantation is twofold. Firstly, because when Bayle starts his second phase, he unleashes a powerful wave of lightning and magma. Secondly, because this is not the first example of lightning being used to fashion a solid object. Placidusax himself does this when he fashions a spear out of lightning before his nuclear attack. That being said, while red lightning is the power of the ancient dragons, and we don't see any drakes wielding this power in the lands between, it seems as though Bayle was able to pass on this ability to some of his closest kin who still reside with him at Jagged Peak, albeit they cannot wield it to nearly the same degree as the ancient dragons or Bayle. As Vadi points out in his video on Bayle, these specific Jagged Peak drakes also drop the item called Dragon Scale Flesh, which states it grows on urged dragons. Specifically, I concur with Vadavidia's conclusion on this, that this means these drakes are likely some of the oldest drakes in existence, thus may be a bit closer to ancient dragons genetically and able to use the red lightning to some degree. So while Bayle is a proto-drake, he still retains a lot of the features of the ancient dragons, showing exactly where he sits in the evolutionary scale. He is simultaneously an ancient dragon and the father of a new subspecies. Indeed, when he led his rebellion, it would have been other ancient dragons that joined him. There would have been few drakes at this stage, for he would father the majority of this entire race. The fact that he was joined by traitor ancient dragons is confirmed by the item description of the red lightning pot, which reads the following. The ancient dragons who betrayed their lord to side with a tyrant were known for wielding branching red lightning. This would explain the presence of the likes of ancient dragon Sinesax, who is found guarding the upper reaches of Bayle's domain. This was an ancient dragon civil war, a split between the two most powerful of their kind. These were tools of the old dragon communion warriors, the key word there being old, which, in addition to the harpoons sporting sharp gravel stone, might suggest these warriors had the ancient dragon's favor back when the ancients were taking a direct hand in wiping out the drakes. As for what actually killed the gargantuan drake, if you go behind it, you'll notice an enormous spike jutting out from the nape of its neck. And if you travel over the drake's head, you'll actually be able to get up there and get a closer look down at the thing. So through the center of the object is this straight piece of what looks like metal around which some sort of stone growth has formed. What's more, the metal has a blue-green tinge to it. So what is this thing? My first impulse was just to call it a huge dragon communion harpoon. The metal rod down the center might have simply corroded over time, and the smaller harpoons do actually have a bit of a green tint to them as well, and green rust is common to metals like copper and brass after all. On that note, I've seen some speculation online that the green could indicate that the metal is verdigris, which, according to the verdigris discus, is a corroded metal known for its heft. This is a great theory, and it really helps to tie the harpoons to crafting techniques that would have become unique to the realm of shadow. But to play devil's advocate, none of this really explains the rounded stone growths around the metal, which aren't sharp gravel stone like you'd think they should be on a harpoon. One theory I came across that's really cool is that the stone buildup might be fulgurite, which apparently is a sort of fossilized lightning that can occur from lightning strikes. Therefore, another theory is that this giant stake might actually be the remnant of a lightning strike, or perhaps more accurately, a dragon communion harpoon that has been imbued with lightning. I feel like that combines all of the theories together. But for this giant drake to have been struck down by lightning, that would suggest that the ancient dragons were around to smite it down. So is there evidence for the ancient dragons being a part of this battle? Well, maybe. An item called sharp gravel stone is found nearby on the corpses of lesser drakes. The description reveals that this sharp gravel stone is actually the scale of an ancient dragon that has supped on the blood of lesser dragons, suggesting ancient dragons were here, I think, and that they were feasting upon the drakes. What's more, red fulgur bloom is found on the south coast of the Jagged Peak, and is said to bloom where the red lightning of the ancient dragon strikes the earth. This description seems to suggest this flower was, in fact, not set to bloom by the flame lightning that assails the peak, but rather by the red lightning of the ancient dragons. And this is probably a good time to mention that there are ancient dragons upon the Jagged Peak who are not hostile to Bayle, so it might not have even been the hostile ancient dragons that generated the fulgur bloom or supped upon the drakes. It might have been friendly ones. This brings us to ancient dragon Cinesax, who, among other ancients, is actually on Bayle's side. And it's very interesting to note that these ancient dragons saw some merit in Bayle's challenge to Placidusax. For them to switch sides, you'd think there really must have been some injustice in the Dragon Lord's persecution of their lowborn kin. Either that, or perhaps these traitorous ancients simply believed that Bayle was stronger than the Dragon Lord, and maybe they believed that might makes right. It's impossible to know for sure. We learn about these traitorous ancient dragons from the hefty red lightning pot, which does this lightning owie where it strikes and reads that this is the branching red lightning of the traitorous ancient dragons. At first, I thought that the branching red lightning would be this attack, but it can't be. These are actually called lightning stakes, and they're the hallmark of other dragons who definitely are not on Bayle's side. Thus, I think the branching red lightning is instead this sort of chain lightning that is characterized by its ability to branch out and chain between enemies. This is the same lightning that Cinesax and the new lightning consumables generate. One fascinating thing that happens after you defeat Cinesax is that when you reload the area, the space Cinesax occupied will instead be filled with a number of these slimes that are imbued with red lightning. The implication being, I think, that Cinesax's flesh has degraded into this form. Fun fact, in the DLC Early Access, These were accidentally silver tears imbued with red lightning, which they quickly corrected to these fleshier variants instead upon release. And I think it's a significant change because in the game's data, this variant of slime is called wriggle carrion, and carrion is explicitly defined as a dead animal's decaying flesh. You might not think that the ancient dragons would have flesh, but they do. They can bleed, they can be poisoned, they can rot, and they can die if they are severely wounded. So too, apparently, can they become undying carrion, imbued with red lightning. Now it is a bit weird that these are the only ancient dragons to turn into this sort of carrion. However, maybe it only happens to Cinesax and her brood, because they wield that branching red lightning that we talked about. Maybe that's how the carrion inherited this red lightning, at least. Anyway, I think FromSoftware implemented this carrion spawn because they wanted to signpost other areas where ancient dragons like Cinesax would have once stood upon the Jagged Peak. So now we know that where there's carrion, there was once an ancient dragon. And sure enough, wherever you find this red lightning infused carrion, you'll also commonly find ancient dragon smithing stones nearby, which are the scales of these beasts. Therefore, I think that in these places, ancient dragons died. But whether they were allied with Bayle and died to Drake warriors, or whether they were allied with Placidusax and died assaulting the Jagged Peak, I think is up to you to decide. It is definitely easy to think of Bayle as a drake, but he himself is actually closer to an ancient dragon, despite him being the father of what we know as modern drakes. In fact, Bayle's unique evolutionary features could be the reason he is so immensely powerful and dangerous. He possesses the lightning affinity of the ancients, yet also possesses the predatory instincts and animalistic strength of the modern drakes. This in-between stage between dragon and drake is also something we see in Dark Souls in the shape of Seath the Scaleless. Bayle, to me, is in a similar position to Seath the first proto-drake, still one of the ancient dragons, but also the beginning of something else. He has lost the front legs and gravelstone scales of the ancient dragons, and yet he still wields the lightning. If this is the case, and it follows a similar evolutionary chart to Dark Souls, then is there something analogous to the First Flame? Well, it is possible there isn't, and Bayle is just a new stage in evolution that happened over many, many generations. However, it is possible something did affect the dragons in order to cause an evolutionary split, the Crucible. I would like to credit content creator Smoketown, from whom I first heard this theory. Smoketown does excellent videos, and I would highly recommend their channel. In the relevant video, Smoketown made some really thought-provoking arguments regarding the nature of what a crucible is, and again, I would recommend you watch that video in full as it goes into a lot of detail. However, what is of relevance for this video is the suggestion that Bayle is essentially a dragon who has been crucible-touched, pointing out his horns and the horns and feathers of the Drakekin. To be clear, and to not misrepresent Smoketown's video, his idea of what a crucible is far different from my own. The main idea that I am taking from his video is that the crucible may have affected Bayle and is the cause of his evolutionary divergence. Taking this further, I think there is merit to the idea that the crucible spawned a sort of devolved subrace of dragon. For if we read the description of the various crucible talismans, like the feather talisman, the word devolution is specifically mentioned, implying the crucible causes devolution. Additionally, the crucible is often associated with bestial violence, and the drakes are certainly a more beast-like subspecies, with Bayle himself being no exception, the avatar of violence and destruction that he is. Thus, is it not possible that the emergence of the crucible caused a segment of the dragon species to devolve from the highly refined ancient dragons, starting with Bayle? If so, this would make it analogous to Dark Souls, with the emergence of the crucible's power affecting the dragon species. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Either way, an aberration among his kind, Bayle would emerge, and his magnificent strength would draw ancient dragons to his side who would join him in rebellion. But why did Bayle rebel in the first place? You might wonder. Well, I believe the answer lies in the item description of some key items, like Bayle's own heart, which reads the following: "Even after being consumed, the throbbing heart of Bayle continues to resist its subjugation, never weakening." A couple of things to note here. First is that it is in Bayle's nature to resist subjugation, and I believe he therefore resented Placidusax's rule over him. I also think it is in his nature to be violent and aggressive, and thus it was in his nature to challenge the current alpha for supremacy. The Talisman of Dread reads the following: "Bayle was the foul dragon's name, a terrible harbinger of destruction, whose challenge to the ancient dragon lord ended in grievous mutual injury." As we learn from the likes of Fortisax and Lansaix, the ancient dragons were capable of being civilized. They were able to commune with humans, and they of course built a great civilization. The ancient dragons represent the ordered, intelligent, and civilized aspect of the dragon. Bayle, in contrast, is the bestial aspect of the dragon, a predator whose instinct is not to build but to destroy, and thus he would have chafed in their society and under Placidusax's rule. This innate, vicious nature of Bayle's is reinforced by Florisax's commentary, who makes a comparison between Egan and Bayle. I remember that name well. The broken Drake warrior, driven by bottomless hunger and fiery ambition. Precisely what the Dragon Lord envisaged for men who partake in dragon communion. The mad hunger and fierceness of spirit that only flows from those young and short of sight. He rather reminds me of Bayle, in fact. Additionally, we may get further insight into Bayle's true destructive nature by his affinity to magma and fire. The Talisman of Dread enhances magma, and additionally it says the following: "Talisman depicting the dread dragon of the Jagged Peak, whose roars cause the peak's molten fury to boil and churn." Bayle's roars literally affect the environment around him, the volcanic mountain he perched upon subject to his moods and influence. Bayle is a force of nature, a manifestation of destruction and primal, bestial fury. Bayle is not a civilized creature, he is one of violence, and thus he was always bound to rage against Placidusax and his order. To really dig into this point, Placidusax was Elden Lord, consort to a god who bore the Elden Ring. He is a lord and force of order. Despite the typical depiction of dragons as harbingers of destruction, I think the ancient dragons are actually beings more associated with order and civilization. Conversely, Bayle is a force of disorder, and if Smoketown is correct in suggesting Bayle is a being affected by the Crucible, then it is fitting he acts as a force of violence, given the Crucible is more closely associated with chaos, violence, and beasts. Bayle is referred to as a tyrant in multiple different sources, and as such, I believe Bayle also wanted power for himself. He saw himself as stronger than Placidusax. Bayle has such a vicious reputation, I cannot help but wonder if he committed acts of terror before he even challenged Placidusax, perhaps taking to the skies and hunting lesser life forms, thus earning his reputation as a harbinger of destruction. Either way, Bayle would bring ancient dragons to his cause, and a civil war would ensue, with the two mightiest dragons locked in a combat which must have been quite the sight, as they must have been almost godlike in terms of power. Two titans tearing into one another and causing massive mutual injury that essentially resulted in the slow decline of Bayle's faction and dragon civilization as a whole. Placidusax's wounds were terrible. Bayle tore off a number of his heads, which still seem plastered to Bayle's body, as if they are trophies, their jaws still locked around the tyrant's throat. He additionally caused great wounds to the Dragon Lord's hide, revealing his golden flesh underneath. However, Placidusax gave as good as he got, completely shredding the tyrant's black wings and severing one of his legs. And as such, Bayle was forced to retreat, crashing down onto Jagged Peak, never to return to Farum Azula. Once settled here, Bayle would warp the landscape around him, his roar causing the volcano to roil and bleed. His affinity for the lightning would wreath the peak in an endless storm, and where his red lightning struck, red fulgur bloom would grow. He would be feared in the surrounding lands, a natural disaster with malicious intent, and with him his brood would grow. From Jagged Peak his kin would go out into the world that would continue his legacy of violence. So there are two main things we need to discuss following this cataclysmic battle, the actions of Placidusax in the aftermath. And we of course need to talk about the birth of the modern dragon race. I would like to start with the latter, to keep Bayle as the focus for now. Let's start with the location of Jagged Peak and how it relates to the propagation of the Drake race. Reflecting on what I said earlier about Bayle representing disorder, Jagged Peak is an excellent home for these predators. As a volcano, it is a natural representation of violence and disorder. No wonder Bayle has an affinity for magma. Conversely, Placidusax represents order and remains seated in the throne of a sophisticated city-state. This divide makes this evolutionary crossroad even more significant, with both species parting thematically as well as literally. The ancient dragons cling to their crumbling civilization, and the drakes devolve into territorial predators. We see this strong territorial behavior in most of the modern dragons we face, like Heel, who descends upon us from above as soon as we encroach on his nest. There were, of course, the ice dragons who laid claim to the mountaintops before the giants drove them off, but they never again were builders of civilizations. They take after their ancestor, beings of violence and predation rather than of order. Their physical form, of course, lends themselves to this type of lifestyle. They no longer have the four arms that the ancient dragons have that would lend themselves to building Etzer. Their form is more like that of a bird of prey, which is unsurprising given who their ancestor is. That is not to say that they are entirely unintelligent, non-sentient beasts, as we do get examples of drakes acting in an intelligent manner. For example, we have Ajula, who swore an oath to Rani, as well as the other glintstone dragons who swore an oath to Renala. Additionally, we have decaying Ixyx, who is known as the Dragon Communion Revenger, meaning he purposefully hunted down Dragon Communion warriors, and this is a purposeful, conscious act. I earlier mentioned that it was unlikely that many, if any, drakes existed at the time Bayle rebelled. Given drakes seem to be almost entirely of his bloodline, it is of course possible that all surviving drakes are of his line and that there were drakes contemporary to Bayle who were killed in the Civil War, thereby leaving all surviving drakes as his bloodline only. Additionally, he may have begun to propagate his bloodline while still a member of Ancient Dragon Society, but I do believe the majority of drakes will have come into existence after his exile. However, as I said earlier, Bayle is an evolutionary bridge between the drakes and the ancient dragons, and I think that Bayle first took ancient dragons to be his mate, and eventually the resulting offspring would give rise to the modern dragons as the ancient dragon genes were eventually bred out. Specifically, we learn that Greol is reputedly the mother of all modern dragons, as Greol's roar reads the following: Greol was the mother of all dragons, dwarfing all who stood before her like a looming mountain. Greol is the mother of all modern dragons, meaning she must have mated with Bayle at some stage, given all modern dragons seem to be his bloodline. Greol is also significantly larger than most modern dragons, and so here is my suggestion. Greol herself was the offspring of Bayle's mating with an ancient dragon, one of his followers who joined him in his betrayal against the Dragon Lord. Then, in turn, Greol was Bayle's mate, and from these two, the modern dragon bloodline would flow. I also think Greol's size is perhaps an indication of her proximity to the ancient dragons genetically, given she is one of the first alongside Bayle. I would also suggest that the giant drake found near Cerulean Coast could have been one of the oldest drakes, perhaps an early offspring of Greol and Bayle. So, while I believe that the drakes largely came about following Bayle's exile, there is some evidence that larger drakes like Greol and the one at Cerulean Coast did live in Farum Azula. I want to direct your attention to the Dragon Mausoleum in Farum Azula. In this room, we can see a giant dragon skull, and I hadn't given much thought to this skull previously. However, looking at it now, I believe that is a giant drake's skull, as it shares more features with a drake than an ancient dragon. It has the frontal horn of Draken, and the fins found alongside its jaw are again a classic feature of a drake's physiology. I take this to mean that Bayle and Reviled had begun to propagate the first of the drakes, who were very large, and that this was even before his battle with the Dragon Lord, colossal drakes like the owner of the skull and the one found at Cerulean Coast. But how is all this possible if Bayle is in the Lands of Shadow and Reviled is found at the Dragon Barrow? Well, you have to remember that the Lands of Shadow were not always separate from the lands between, with the shroud that separates them only coming about during Marika's reign. I also believe that Farum Azula once sat alongside the Bestial Sanctum, not only because it has similar architecture to Farum Azula, but because it is where Malekith has decided to hide as a member of the Beast Clergy, constituent members of Farum Azula society. Of course, even more obviously, we have the Farum Great Bridge, all but confirming that Farum Azula sat here before Placidusax's action sent it skyward, but more on that later. Likewise, I agree with the map overlay that was done by Gillibite, and I will link that original Reddit post below. In this overlay, it basically places Jagged Peak right on top and next to Grail's Dragon Barrow. And I agree with this not only from how the placement seems to fit, but also from a lore perspective it works. If Grail is the mother of all modern dragons and thus Bayle's mate, she would need proximity to him. Additionally, Dragon Barrow represents the largest concentration of drakes in the lands between. Thus, it does not make sense that this would have once been the hinterlands surrounding Jagged Peak. If I am also right about Farum Azula once being situated on the ground in this location, then I feel this also fits. It makes sense that an injured Bayle would crash land and settle in a location near to Farum Azula, given his heavy wounds and need to recover. One final piece of contextual evidence that may point to Farum Azula, Jagged Peak, and Dragon Barrow all being situated next to each other is the presence of undead beastmen at Jagged Peak. Again, we do have to wonder how these beings would have come to be here had Jagged Peak not originally rested next to Farum Azula. So to surmise, I believe that Jagged Peak and Farum Azula once lay next to one another, next to the region called Dragon Barrow, where the Bestial Sanctum and Farum Great Bridge remain as the final earthbound remnants of the dragon civilization. However, Jagged Peak was eventually dragged into the Lands of Shadow, and Farum Azula was sent skyward, and thus only the Sanctum and the bridge remain. One final thing I want to talk about is the malleability and diversity of drake kind, which is a thing that seems absent from the more uniform ancient dragons. We see this in the vast varieties of modern drakes that we encounter in the lands between frost, rot, and glintstone dragons, for example, beings affected by their environment so much that their form and breath attacks are radically different. This doesn't seem to be a slow evolutionary change that happens over generations in response to their environment. Rather, it seems as though the dragons literally absorb elements from their environment and their body adapts accordingly. The clearest example of this is the glintstone dragons like Smaragd and Ajula, and we learned about how they came to be via Smaragd's glintstone breath, which reads the following: Smaragd was a devourer of sorcerers, and over time, his body became corrupted by their glintstones. So it is via his diet that Smaragd absorbed glintstones, and it became part of his physiology. And we know Ajula was a devourer of sorcerers as well, thanks to Ajula's moonblade, and thus he too was corrupted in this manner. I therefore assume that all other subspecies of drake also are warped by their environment. Another easy example of this would be Exyx, who is described as being overcome by the rot, by Exyx's decay. This is definitely an evolutionary advantage, allowing the drakes to thrive in environments the ancient dragons might not be able to. Additionally, it would grant them unusual and powerful abilities, as is the case of the glintstone dragons, who can manipulate the glintstone within them and produce glintstone magic. It's all in line with the thematic symbolism of the dragon species split. On one side, you have the uniform and ordered ancient dragons, representatives of the civilization and intelligence of dragons. On the other, you have the drakes, chaotic, animalistic, and bestial, representing the violent side of dragonkind. Yet, while Bayle's bloodline flourished, he would not be left to lick his wounds in peace, for the Dragon Lord would visit his vengeance upon the Dread and his blood. We meet Florisax at what is perhaps the first religious site for dragon communion, below the corpse of a massive drake with its heart ripped out and a communion bowl beneath it that would match the size of this large organ. It is a less formal site than the Dragon Communion Church and Cathedral, and thus I think this is likely the earliest religious site of this pact between man and dragons. Zully the Witch recently did a really interesting video assessing this giant drake and who is responsible for its slaying. The death blow is clear to see. A massive sword is still embedded in the beast's skull, and Zully posited a number of potential candidates for the wielder of such a sword. In the video, Zully mentions one candidate that I believe is closest to the truth. Zully compares the sword to Gransax's and notes that the sword would indeed fit Gransax's size. I do believe it was a dragon who struck this beast down, and it was Florisax herself that did it. Florisax's heart tells a lot about her current form and role, as it reads the following: the stone heart of a dragon communion priestess, used while disrobed to turn one's human flesh into an ancient dragon. The priestess was once an ancient dragon herself, but sacrificed that form for feeble flesh to aid in the destruction of Bayle the Dread. Florisax is the Dragon Communion Priestess. She is essentially the pontiff of this cult, and I thus think she was the one who first told man of this pact, and that she did it here, with this great drake as the first offering. Additionally, this heart tells us that she is an ancient dragon, but that she permanently changed her form in order to commune with man and groom them to destroy Bayle. Here is the narrative that I am suggesting. Florisax herself was entrusted with this mission by Placidusax. She came from Farum Azula and slew this giant drake with a sword as a show of strength and as an offering to tempt humanity, all while still in her original dragon form. Then she took on her human-like appearance and offered this pact to man. Take the strength of the dragons, a gift from the Dragon Lord. In exchange, you are to hunt down Bayle the Dread, and thus, the deal was struck. And I imagine her speech would have been similar to the one she gives us when we first meet. Warrior true, picture yourself feasting upon a dragon's essence. On the throbbing heart of the oldest, vilest dragon of them all. It would be the purest form of communion, the fullest sating of your hunger, and your consummation as a dragon whole. Some of the first of the communion warriors would have consumed the heart of the great drake there, and then, under the shadow of its corpse and under the watchful eye of Florisax, this is how I envisage it, and of course, it is speculation, but I do think it fits rather neatly given Florisax's position here and the size of the sword. There is another possibility, and is that Placidusax himself bore this sword, slew the drake, and tore out the heart of the drake as an example to mankind. I say this because of a particular line said by Florisax: "Landbound warrior, my lord Placidusax has shown your kind what must be done." So, while I personally believe this is more a reference to the fact that Dragon Communion is a deck that has been passed down from the Dragon Lord, it could be taken more literally that the wounded Placidusax descended upon this drake and consumed his heart in order to rally humans to his cause. Following this, Florisax would then further serve to spread the word of Dragon Communion in Placidusax's name. I lean more towards Florisax being the killer of this great drake, but I do like both possibilities, and I would love to hear your opinion in the comments below. But let us backtrack a bit and hear what Florisax has to say regarding the initial pact. Since that day, Bayle and his bloodline, the Drakes, have served as sacrifices for Dragon Communion. Landbound warrior, my lord Placidusax has shown your kind what must be done. Seek communion, sate your boundless appetite. Feel the euphoria of a dragon's essence taking root in your meager frame. So the pact can be described as follows. You will receive the strength of the dragon if you hunt and kill the drakes of Bayle, with the ultimate prize being Bayle himself. This clearly will appeal to those who desire strength and violence. This was already very much implied in the base game via Yura and Eleonora's storyline. In this, we witness an intersection between Bloody Fingers and Dragon Communion in the form of Eleonora, who is both a Drake warrior and a Bloody Finger of Moog. The reason for this is evident in Yura's condemnation of both, people who are lost in violence and blood. You must not forget, though, those who partake in Dragon Communion will one day shed their humanity. Their hunger for dragon, their yearning, only worsens until the floodgates burst, unleashing eternal torment. The strength of a mighty dragon, magnificent but deadly. It's no surprise that Dragon Communion is ruinous. Indeed, Florisax very closely echoes Yura's sentiments in her commentary on Egon, where she says the following, driven by bottomless hunger and fiery ambition. Precisely what the Dragon Lord envisaged for men who partake in Dragon Communion. The mad hunger and fierceness of spirit that only flows from those young and short of sight. This pact is meant to attract those of violence, people who will be trapped by their desire for greater power. But this is a path with only one end, and it is a pact that benefits the Dragon Lord far more than it does the human. We know the end result of this bargain, for consuming the heart does indeed transfer the properties of a dragon to a human. It starts with dragon eyes and the power of the consumed, but for those who cannot fully sate their hunger and continue to consume hearts, they will eventually be transformed into the magma worms. This is something we learn via the magma worm's scale sword, which reads the following. It is said these land-bound dragons were once humans, heroes who partook in Dragon Communion, a grave transgression for which they were cursed to crawl the earth upon their bellies, shadows of their former selves. This transgression is punished in much the same way that God punishes the serpent for tempting Eve in the Garden of Eden. These warriors have violated nature itself. The dark act of killing a creature and consuming it to steal its power is an offense against natural life, and thus the result is a mockery. Instead of fully becoming a dragon with the ability to soar through the sky gracefully on wings, they are forced to crawl through the dirt. The final mockery is the presence of small, pathetic wings upon their back, clearly unfit to lift their large bulk from the earth. This all takes on a new meaning when we consider that it was Placidusax who greenlit this project. He cares so little for humans and for the drakes that he is fine condemning humanity to this degenerate state, whilst also encouraging the desecration and humiliation of his distant kin. It is a brutal yet highly effective plan that was put into place by Placidusax. He essentially enacted the genocide of his enemies without spilling a single drop of his own people's blood. He leveraged humanity's capacity for violence against the drakes, whilst making it seem like an honor. That being said, it is clear that some warriors took pride in their service to Placidusax, namely the banished knights that we can find in Farum Azula and Stormvale. I guess that these banished knights were once warriors of Farum Azula, given the dragon iconography that is found on their helmets and their location. I have long believed that Stormvale was originally a fortification that was associated with the dragons, given the connections of storms and the Stormox, which can be found in their natural form in Farum Azula alongside dragons. I posited that the banished knights found here had actually once served the Storm Lord, based on a translation provided by Last Protagonist, where Oleg and Ingval are named as the two wings of the Storm Lord. The Storm Lord was one of the enemies that Godfrey famously defeated, and thus I believe that after that, they likely chose to serve Godfrey because of his proven strength. Hence we can find them and their armor in locations associated with the Golden lineage, like Stormvale Castle and the Round Table Hold. I think I've now been proven correct in linking these warriors and Stormvale to Farum Azula, given we now know Dragon Communion, which they are members of, is a cult associated with the Dragon Lord. However, I did get one thing wrong. I suggested that the Storm Lord was Placidusax, and it was Godfrey who defeated him and wounded him. That is, of course, not true, as we know it was Bayle who mortally wounded him. However, I believe the Storm Lord must have been a vassal lord of Farum Azula, perhaps another dragon, or indeed the Stormhawk monarch, as many have suggested in the past. At least now we do have an explanation for the banished knights, and we know why they patrol the halls of Farum Azula. They owe their allegiance to Placidusax and the dragons, and they seem like a more formalized unit than the more individual cult members like Egon or Eleonora. These are knights who take the power, but also honor the dragons who they served, adorning armor that venerates them, and serving in their armies. We now know them as banished knights, and I likely think this is because their lords have all been defeated, Placidusax and the Storm Lord. Their banishment likely followed the dissolution of the lord they served, and thus they would become almost like mercenaries, serving the lord that best fit their needs, with many of course serving Godfrey and his golden lineage. This is very much suggested by the Ash of Oleg and Ingval, the former of which reads the following. One of the two knights known as the Wings of the Storm, after his banishment, he attracted the notice of the grace-given lord, and later, having slain 100 traitors as the lord's hand, Oleg earned the hero's honor of an Erdtree burial. So, a former knight of the Storm Lord, he chose to serve the grace-given Lord Morgott. And conversely, Ingval rejected this offer and ended up protecting another castle, perhaps Castle Sol. So it is likely that these banished knights are remnants of the older generation of Dragon Communion, in a time where they more directly interacted with Florisax and the ancient dragons, a time where they saw it as an honor to serve as a foot soldier in the Dragon Lord's war against the Drakes. As I said, today, this origin seems to be forgotten, and many that partake in Dragon Communion do so for their own reasons, and are a ragtag collection of desperate warriors. However, I don't believe that banished knights were the very first. I, in fact, believe that honor goes to the ancient Mendragon. We know that this being used to be a Dragon Communion warrior because his Dragon Hunter's great katana reads the following, formerly a Dragon Communion warrior. The ancient dragon man was once arbiter of those worthy to devour the dreaded one. So the Mandragon is guarding the path toward Bayle, not because he is a servant of the dread, but because he too was once a hunter of dragons. And now he plays the role of Judex, judging who is worthy to face Bayle via a test of combat. This is interesting because it once again suggests a ritualistic element to Dragon Communion, and it's important we don't lose sight of that. The word, communion, itself has religious connotations, and it must have been a sacred act, at least at its inception, to consume the heart of a dragon and take its power. Given the combative nature of this movement, it is easy to imagine that ritualized combat would take place among its members. It also draws my attention to the location in which we fight the ancient Mandragon, Dragon's Pit, a location that clearly has a significance to the Dragon Communion cult. It essentially acts as a purification altar, a religious barrier for those of Dragon Communion, the entrance to their most holy site, Jagged Peak, where the ultimate prize to which they can aspire awaits them. The religious nature of the site is clear when you consider the great altar found at its center, which seems to be filled with dragon blood. Additionally, given the presence of undead beastmen here, I have to conclude that this was one of the first Dragon Communion temples built, likely with the assistance of Farum Azula, who sent their beastmen servants to lies with the Dragon Communion warriors. 2 members of the cult remain here, a magma worm, a Dragon Communion warrior who has gone all the way, and of course, we have the ancient Mandragon himself, the moniker of Ancient, being evident enough of how long he has been here. This is only part of the reason I believe him to be one of the first partakers of communion. The rest of the reason is found in the item description of the rock heart, the item that allows us to assume the same form as him. It reads the following, heart consumed in the ancient, original form of dragon communion, used while disrobed to turn one's human flesh into an ancient dragon. The last thing the partaker saw with human eyes was a sunset, its colors faded and tarnished, a remote thing from eternity. So I have many things to say about this fascinating item, so let's start with the top, where it tells us that this heart was consumed in the ancient, original form of dragon communion. This more or less confirms that the ancient Mandragon was a warrior who partook in the original form of this act and is perhaps the oldest communion warrior in existence. To confirm that I wasn't missing anything in translation, I consulted with friend and content creator Last Protagonist, who was kind enough to provide the translation that you can see on screen now. This does essentially line up with my assessment of the English, but one of my reasons for running this by Last Protagonist was to dig into what the meaning of the latter part of the item description is going for. Last Protagonist was able to provide his interpretation of it based on the Japanese, and I do really like this. He suggests that the message being conveyed here is that A, the consumption of this heart took place during a sunset, and B, that attaining dragonhood was the ultimate goal, and once attained, everything around them pales in comparison. So again, massive thanks to Last Protagonist for confirming this information for me. LP does great translation-based lore content, and I would highly recommend his channel if that interests you. Returning to the rock heart, something else interests me. The communion warriors directly take on the powers and form of the dragons that they have consumed. For example, if we consume Smaragd's heart, we get his glintstone breath. So if communion warriors devour the hearts of drakes and take on their attributes, why does the Mandragon transform into an ancient dragon specifically? Surely this means he has consumed the heart of an ancient dragon rather than a drake. Indeed, the rock heart specifically names this as the heart that was consumed, and yet it doesn't match the drake hearts we are used to. Modern dragon hearts are mainly fleshy, albeit with some gravelstone shards in it. However, the rock heart is exactly that, a heart that is entirely composed of gravelstone. And again, to reiterate, it transforms the user into an ancient dragon, not a drake. I think it is fair to conclude that the original, ancient version of communion involved consuming the hearts of ancient dragons. But why? Well, as we discussed earlier, we know there were traitors among the ancient dragons who sided with Bayle. So, is it possible the original, ancient form of communion actually targeted these treasonous ancient dragons? I think that is the most likely explanation. Ancient dragons being the initial target also explains another environmental detail that has long puzzled me: the corpses of ancient dragons that are found at sites of dragon communion. My conclusion is that these sites were founded by the killing and consumption of an ancient dragon. Additionally, I think it is the gravelstone scales of these ancient dragons that are used as the fuel for the fires we find at these sites. I have never given much thought to the pink flames that are found at these sites, but I do think we have an answer now, because the weapon of the ancient Mandragon can produce a similar flame. The Ash of War of the Dragon Hunter's great katana is called Dragon One Slash, and its description reads the following: designed to hunt colossal dragons. This skill cloaks the armament with a jagged gravelstone aura before performing a high-leaping slash. So this pink flame is a gravelstone aura, and so we have to assume that the flames found at the dragon communion sites are burning the gravelstone scales of traitor ancient dragons. We can only consume the hearts at these sites, and so part of the process must be to cook or singe the hearts in the flames before consuming them. Again, something I puzzled over in the past is that these shrines possess the same lion iconography of Farum Azula. The answer was always there, I just didn't have all the pieces. These shrines and this practice were created by Farum Azula and the Dragon Lord to use humans in hunting down ancient dragon traitors, and then the modern drakes. I think that these traitors were largely wiped out, and thus the new target became the modern drakes. And Dragon Communion would become what we know it as today, The fact that even the banished knights wield only the powers of modern drakes suggests that those who partook in the ancient, original dragon communion, like the Mandragon, will have been a rarefied, ancient, and select group. There is just one final detail of note in this item description that I want to zoom in on, and that is where it says that this sword was meant to hunt colossal dragons, specifically. Now, the regular drakes are big, but I wouldn't describe them as colossal. I would, however, describe Bayle, Grail, and the giant drake as colossal. Is this further evidence that the early generations of drakes were bigger? I would like to think so, and it just makes me really curious about this ancient, original form of dragon communion. Florisax would oversee and administer these rites, and she made a great sacrifice to do so, as her heart description tells us that this isn't just a temporary transformation, and instead implies that she irreversibly became a human. Perhaps I am reading that incorrectly, but the term sacrifice, to me, doesn't imply that this is a transformation that can simply be undone. And yet, conversely, Lansix does seem to be able to reverse her form. We know from Lansix's glaive that she took the form of a human priestess in order to propagate the ancient dragon cult in Lindell, and we have to assume this is a similar form to that of Florisax. And yet, when we fight Lansix, she is in ancient dragon form, so clearly she is capable of changing her form with ease. So why can't Florisax? Well, the first explanation is that I am wrong about Florisax and she can change back. And the sacrifice is merely taking a human form for as long as she has to. Alternatively, perhaps Florisax is unable to turn back to dragon form because she has spent too long as a human, and as such has become one over a long period of time. As always, I invite your opinions on Florisax's position in the comments below. Florisax's dragon communion cult is a dark reflection to the ancient dragon cult that would later take root in Lindell. We now know that the Dragon Communion cult is far older than the Capital cult, and they both represent a different relationship between humanity and dragonkind. Dragon Communion was created by Placidusax in order to leverage humanity's fury against Bayle. It is a relationship of utility, with both sides using one another, the dragons using humans to kill their foes, and humans using the strength of the dragons. Comparatively, the ancient dragon cult is one built upon friendship, respect, and mutual cooperation. We know that the Capital cult was founded on the respect and friendship that Fortisax and Godwyn had for one another. For example, the incantation Electrify Armament reads the following: Long ago, Godwyn the Golden defeated the ancient dragon Fortisax and befriended his fallen foe, an event that gave rise to the ancient dragon cult in the Capital. These are two former enemies shaking hands, putting their past grievances behind them, and sharing strength with one another. Fortisax and Lansix helped train the Knights of Lindell so that they too might wield the power of the lightning. In response, the humans of the Capital admire the strength of the dragons. They honor it, but they do not violently claim it as they do in Dragon Communion, nor are their bodies corrupted in the process. It is mutual and it is respectful, an alliance rather than a dark pact. Given what we know about Placidusax's intent with Dragon Communion, it really makes clear the difference between these two cults, and how one is a pure relationship between human and dragon. One is directly instituted by the Dragon Lord, the other seemingly had nothing to do with him. It was a mutual pact between Godwyn and Fortisax, a cooperative effort that created an alliance between Dragon and Lindell. I wonder if the Dragon Lord would approve. I recently watched a video by another content creator, Aeon of Aesthetics, who discussed the theme of madness in FromSoftware games, and he made a very poignant observation about the ancient dragon cult, that while the ancient dragons have lost power themselves, with the establishment of this pact, they find a place of respect and reverence in Marika's order, becoming a symbol of strength for the warriors of Lindell. The longevity of the dragon cult is evidenced by the fact that Vyke would become a member of it, a fact given to us by Vyke's Dragon Bolt and his skill with these incantations. Vyke is a tarnished, meaning that the cult would have to still be in operation by the time of the Shattering and the return of the Tarnished. This does seem obvious given Lansakes' continued presence in the capital, but it is an interesting thing to note. Bayle and Placidusax took mutual injuries, and so too were their broods wounded by this event, really marking the beginning of Dragonkind's decline. Let's first look at Placidusax and the state we find him in a state of stasis or coma. I think Placidusax's name is a reference to his placid state of being, a sort of meditation to not only preserve his weakened form, but to seek guidance, as Smoftown suggests in his Crucible Lord video. I do believe that Placidusax is taking the form of an antenna, mirroring the two fingers in an attempt to contact the greater will following the calamities that have befallen his civilization. The true extent of his fall is expanded upon by his remembrance, which reads the following. The Dragon Lord, whose seat lies at the heart of the storm beyond time, is said to have been Elden Lord in the age before the Erd Tree. Once his god was fled, the Lord continued to await its return. So a couple of things here. The first is that his god has fled, i.e., his Marika to his god Frey has gone, and in essence, this likely marked the end of the dragons being the custodians of the Elden Ring. Eventually, Marika would be its vessel, but I imagine before that there would be interim gods, and I do suspect that the Hornsent had their own god who Marika slew and stole power from. I think Bayle's wounding of Placidusax and the dragon civil war is what caused the dragons to fall from grace, and was the reason his consort fled. It was a massive blow from which the civilization would not recover, and there was a final blow to come. I've discussed at length how Farum Azula once sat on the ground next to the Bestial Sanctum, and yet we see Farum Azula in a very different state. We see it skyward, and it is described as beyond time by the Dragon Lord's remembrance. Farum Azula is also crumbling, and we know that with the establishment of this pact, they find a place of respect and reverence in Marika's order, Ruin's Greatsword, which reads, originally rubble from a ruin which fell from the sky, this surviving fragment was honed into a weapon. The ruin it came from crumbled when struck by a meteorite. As such, this weapon harbors its destructive power. Now, we have two possibilities here. First is that Farum Azula was struck by a meteor, and as a result, it was sent skyward due to the gravitational properties associated with meteors in Elden Ring, after which Placidusax managed to preserve its full destruction by freezing it beyond time. While this is what I used to believe, I think I was wrong, as this description specifically says that this rubble fell from the sky, meaning Farum Azula was already skyward when it was struck by the aforementioned meteor. So I now believe that it was Placidusax's act of preserving his throne beyond time that sent the entire city skyward. Indeed, this does seem self-evident when you consider that it is clearly being kept afloat by the storm at the center of the city, rather than any gravity magic. Evidently, the city has been here and crumbling for a very long time, given the wording of the Old Lord's talisman, which reads the following, a legendary talisman depicting the ancient king whose seat lies at the heart of the storm beyond time. It is said that the ancient royal city of Farum Azula has been slowly crumbling since time immemorial, so events like the meteor hit have served to help break up the crumbling city and allow it to fall onto the lands between, as is the case with the Ruin's Greatsword, and the fragments we can find in the likes of Limgrave. But what is the vortex that is keeping the city afloat? What is happening here? Well, I believe this is a unique power of the Dragon Lord, and is being used to preserve his damaged and wounded body in the hope that one day they can simply retake power and delay their decline. As I will discuss shortly, I now believe that it is Placidusax's throne alone that is beyond time, not Farum Azula as a whole. The gravelstone scales of the ancient dragons have a unique quality to them, and this is something we learned via the dragon scale blade, which reads the following, a weapon made by sharpening a gravelstone scale, thought to be the source of ancient dragon immortality, into an unclouded blade. Alas, the dragonkin soldiers never attained immortality and perished as decrepit, pale imitations of their skyborn kin. So much like their counterparts in Dark Souls, the ancient dragons of Elden Ring owe their immortality to the scales themselves. The scales of Placidusax are able to affect time, never aging because he himself exists beyond time. The ancient dragon smithing stone reads the following: smithing stone made by polishing a golden gravel stone, a scale of the ancient dragon lord, and hidden treasure of Farum Azula. The ancient dragon lord's seat is said to lie beyond time. This stone lightly twists time, allowing the creation of a weapon capable of slaying a god. So quite a bit to unpack here. I think that all dragon scales have this ability to manipulate time. And this is why they are immortal, because they are beings that are not subject to time and aging. And I do believe this is likely the case. The ancient dragons are immortal because their scales are beyond time. However, to be precise, the ancient dragon smithing stones are specifically of the Dragon Lord, perhaps suggesting that Placidusax's placement beyond time has made the time manipulation qualities of his scales even more potent, to the point that they could be used to slay a god via time manipulation. I personally believe the wording of the Old Lord's talisman suggests that it is specifically Placidusax only, not Farum Azula as a whole, that is beyond time. This is the area that is literally enclosed within the eye of the storm, and the idea that this is the only region beyond time is reinforced by the cinematic we get prior to the Placidusax boss fight, where time literally rewinds. Returning his throne to its pre-ruined state and revealing Placidusax hidden beyond time. Indeed, if all of Farum Azula existed beyond time, then surely we wouldn't be able to see it at all, as Placidusax's throne is actually not visible until we pierce the veil, and then time rewinds and Placidusax is revealed to our eyes. Yet we can freely see the crumbling ruins of Farum Azula from multiple points in the lands between, and it is not being preserved. It is indeed crumbling and falling apart. Additionally, a really good point was made in a Reddit post by Tommy Liddell, which reinforces this suggestion. In this post, Tommy highlights the item description of Miquella's needle, where it specifically says that one must go to the heart of the storm in order to take advantage of its time manipulation properties. Indeed, it is only usable in the Dragon Lord's arena, not Farum Azula as a whole. Thus, I think it is clear that the Dragon Lord is responsible for the time-warping storm that affects Farum Azula. He is a master of lightning beyond any other dragon, himself being able to become incorporeal and take the form of a storm before emerging and descending upon his chosen prey. I think the great tornado of Farum Azula was manifested by Placidusax, and it tore Farum Azula from the ground, kept in orbit around his great tornado. As an aside, there is another interesting detail that has new meaning thanks to the DLC, and that is the backdrop of Farum Azula, where you can see many dragons circling the ruins. If you look carefully, you will note that these are actually drakes, and in the past, I just believed that they were drawn here because it is their ancestral home. However, now that we know the drakes and the ancient dragons are mortal enemies, this skybox takes on a more sinister quality to me. They are like vultures circling a dying beast, ready to descend on Farum Azula and feast upon those who remain. They are likely only dissuaded by Placidusax and his storm. There is something else very interesting here though. Placidusax still seems able to communicate with his agents in his meditative state, and this is again something we learn from the DLC in Florisax. In the evenings, Florisax does something rather interesting. She offers her sleep to the Dragon Lord.
My dear Lord Placidusax, tonight, like every night, my solace is yours. May it grant you sleep in your place beyond time.
It seems as though Florisax not only serves her lord by leading the communion cult, but at night, she literally stays awake, offering her sleep to him. The purpose of this, from her own words, seems to be to help him maintain his meditative state beyond time. The mechanics of this are unclear, but I wonder if other dragons join with Florisax every night, donating their sleep to Placidusax so he can maintain his. As I've said, I do feel the time manipulation is a method through which Placidusax can preserve his wounded form. When we do eventually fight him, he is essentially Placidusax of thousands of years ago, whereas when we face Bayle, we are fighting a beast who has been nursing his wounds all these years. Placidusax is likely fresher and has been able to stave off further degradation or even death. It does more or less confirm what I said earlier, that Placidusax is in a placid state of meditation, likely seeking guidance from the greater will and communicating with his subjects. For it seems as though Florisax is connected to her lord via her ties to his sleep, as she says the following if we use Thialir's concoction to force her to sleep. I have broken my pledge. I succumbed to the deep slumber that was meant for my lord. It was a craven act of a foul and lowly beast. Forgive me, good warrior. My lord will no longer look upon me. I have fallen from grace. An old dragon no longer. So again, lots of interesting information there. First is that by going to sleep, she stole the gift that was meant for Placidusax. Secondly, she seems to innately know that her lord will no longer look upon her, as if she had a connection to him, a direct line that has thus been severed, an instant and severe punitive measure from her lord. But it has a lot of interesting implications for Placidusax and how he can communicate with his subjects, even displaced as he is again. I think the idea that the offering of sleep creates a connection between the two is reinforced by the item description of the ancient dragon's blessing, which reads the following: favor bestowed by the Dragon Communion Priestess in the name of the Dragon Lord Placidusax. Each night, the priestess offers her own sleep to her lord, and in turn receives the power of his favor. So this shows the connection between lord and servant, with Placidusax rewarding his priestess with his favor, a powerful tool that she can bestow upon us in our quest to slay Bayle. Placidusax is thus shown to be very unforgiving, completely cutting off his loyal servant because she made a single mistake. Overall, Placidusax's gamble has had some success, yet failed in other respects. Whilst he has been preserved, Bayle has been left to suffer for all these years. Additionally, it is clear that the ancient dragons would have lacked the numbers to take on the drakes themselves. In fact, I wager they may well have lost a direct fight with them, so leveraging the rage of humanity has been a master stroke, as the drakes are slowly brought down by relentless drake warriors who grow stronger with each communion. However, Placidusax has remained in the past, desperately trying to contact the greater will, yet the greater will clearly isn't answering. Meanwhile, Drakekind circles Farum Azula, vultures ready to pick clean the bones of their enemies. Whether you believe the greater will no longer exists or the dragons have simply fallen out of its favor is up to you. The results are the same. Power has long left the dragons and eventually ends up in the hands of Marika and her kin. I do believe this is the reason that the dragons, led by Grandsax, attacked Leyndell. It was a desperate, last-ditch attempt to reclaim power. It is impossible to know whether Placidusax himself ordered this, or whether it was a rogue move made by the likes of Grandsax and Fortisax. Either way, it failed and in fact led to a stronger, more mutual bond between the ancient dragons and Leyndell. The power of the dragons was broken, and their remnants are merely reminders of past glories. But this does not mean Drakekind would escape the Dragon Lord's vengeance. And so let us move into the final chapter, where we review the conclusion of Bayle's story. I suppose that by defeating the ancient dragon man, in a way, you cleared the path for him that he could not conquer himself. Because of you, he can go down and out of the chasm that requires a Dragon Communion warrior to be brave and show no fear. Egan, pity us, Egan, do you not remember? Conjure your past, how one you were when fear was yet foreign to ye. Drake warrior, dear friend, grant me this one wish. Take this finger, my finger, scale the jagged peak, face Bayle the Dread, and when you do, summon me. Summon my soul, My limbs are limbs no more, my heart is twice overfilled with fear, but a Drake warrior I remain, and my soul yet lies on the mountain. With this, you bring Egon on your quest. Or rather, he brings you on his. Egon's bell bearing that you loot here can be used to craft Egon's harpoons, which can be fired from his bow, which is imbued with Egon's obsession. The harpoons read, "Hurl these at Bayle, the Dread, and make him know fear." But I think Bayle has already known fear, at the behest of a great enemy who he fled from after suffering his grievous wounds, which included the loss of a leg. It's the same as what happened to Egon. The Elder Phantom asks, "O Bayle, do your wounds yet ache?" and has been waiting endlessly for Bayle's fury to crest its zenith. But clearly Bayle has done little in this time. The only evidence we have of Bayle striking against Placidusax at all, if you can call it that, is the presence of the drakes flying all around Farum Azula. Given this new context of a mutual hatred between the drakes and the ancient dragons, I wonder, are these drakes flying around in some sort of suppression of Farum Azula? Or is their presence this environmental set piece that we were never supposed to look too far into? I'd love to know if anyone has any good speculation on this. Perhaps there's little these drakes or Bayle can do to reach the Dragon Lord, because Placidusax has long dwelled in his seat at Farum Azula, in his place beyond time, waiting for his god to Somehow, the Dragon Priestess devotes her sleep to Placidusax, an act that likely makes his eternity of waiting easier to bear. And yet, he would abandon her in a mere instant should she drink Thealier's concoction and falter in her duty. I have broken my pledge. I succumb to the deep slumber that was meant for my lord. 'Twas a craven act of a vile and lowly beast. Forgive me. Good warrior, my lord will no longer look upon me. I have fallen from grace. An old dragon no longer. Go on. Leave me be. Here, Florisax laments that she has fallen from grace, which I feel like might be wording that intentionally draws a parallel with losing the grace of the Golden Order. The dragons did once have the Elden Ring, after all, so it makes sense that the ancient dragons could have once had grace. But now Florisax has lost Placidusax's grace, and she lost it just like that.
I have broken my pledge. I succumbed to the deep slumber that was meant for my lord. It was a craven act of a foul and lowly beast. Forgive me, good warrior. My lord will no longer look upon me. I have fallen from grace. An old dragon no longer. Go on. Leave me be. My lord will no longer look upon me.
I think this serves to prove just how painfully prideful the ancient dragons are. While we might be the last to ascend Jagged Peak, we are certainly not the first. The slopes of this accursed mountain tell a rather interesting story. It is littered with the corpses of drakes and drake warriors, for the human corpses found here have a dragon's colorbloom within them, and its description reads the following: flower with an uncanny shape, coursing with hot blood. A single flower is said to blossom only once from the hearts of dead warriors who have partook of the dragon communion. So this, of course, confirms that the bodies found here are drake warriors, and the carnage on the mountain tells a story of a long, ongoing siege between man and drake, with both sides taking significant casualties. Most interestingly, it gives context to the red flowers that cover Bayle's arena. Initially, I believed these to be a bit out of place, but actually, it is so obvious. This is to illustrate how many drake warriors have died trying to take down Bayle. The number is overwhelming, and it illustrates both the extreme power of Bayle and the sheer, berserk determination of the drake warriors. It additionally reinforces the transformative process that drake warriors go through by consuming dragon hearts. We, of course, see this plainly in the magma worms and the ancient man-dragon, but it is interesting to note how the physiology of these warriors is warped. Indeed, if you look closely at the dragon's color bloom, then you will notice that the petals look like heart fragments that are embedded with gravelstone scales. This is reflective of how a drake heart looks, showing that the drake warrior's own heart has already begun to become that of a dragon. The Jagged Peak was a volcano once, though it seemed dormant for now. In the surrounds are countless dead drakes, many with that sharp gravel stone upon them that seems to indicate that they were victims of ancient dragons. But even though the description says that they've been supped on, a part of me also thinks they might have just been victim to each other. These dead drakes are surrounded by a Jagged Peak drake here, and further up, 2 Jagged Peak drakes clash with each other. Such a thing reminds me of the description of the horn-strewn excrement, which reads, "It is said that the deadliest of the horned predators enjoy the sport of hunting and devouring other horned creatures." Their clash, I think, is this return to the wildness often seen in the days of the Crucible. In times long past, life was, after all, a crucible of competition. And one revelation from the newfound Bear Communion incantation is that only through desperate battle with the feral wild can one discover a god unique to oneself. So going back to what we said at the start of this video, I feel like there is a connection being made here to the Crucible, to the wildness that is so typical of it, a wildness that persists in the drakes despite the order once granted upon their kin. At any rate, the biggest threat to Bayle still isn't from his drakes. It's from you and Egon. But of course, many of these warriors have fallen, despite the toll they have reaped upon Bayle's brood, and Bayle himself still persists. We meet a ragged dragon communion warrior, broken near the dragon pit, heart full of fear and hate for Bayle the Dread, who ruined him so. This is Egon, the Drake warrior. We know that he is in this state because of a failed attempt on Bayle's life, thanks to the description of Egon's cookbook, which reads the following: "A record of crafting techniques left by a warrior who challenged the vile dragon Bayle, only to be grievously injured and broken by fear, contains details on how a mere mortal can fell a mighty dragon." Indeed, Egon, modeled on Captain Ahab from Moby Dick, has dedicated his life to the singular purpose of slaying Bayle, and he is formidable as a result. As a homage to Captain Ahab in his hunting of Moby Dick, Egon wields javelins in his bow, tipped with gravel stones, of course. What is extraordinary about Egon is that he has humble origins when compared to, say, the Banished Knights, and this is reflected in his makeshift harpoons and armor. His armor set reads the following: Armor of the Broken Drake Warrior, Egon, from a set comprised of a miscellany of parts. Filthy belongings are attached to this tattered piece of protective wear. The poor scavenger of battlefields found honor through dragon communion. So Egon actually was a scavenger, hence why he uses homemade harpoons and has rather raggedy armor. And yet, despite that, this man, armed with sticks and armored in cloth, climbed the Jagged Peak to take on the living avatar of destruction. I already loved Egon, but realizing this is a man who rose from being a scavenger to challenge one of the most powerful beings of an age is truly admirable. As we discussed earlier, Florisax remembers him, his anger and unhinged hunger reminding her of Bayle. Indeed, as Zully the Witch pointed out in their video on Bayle, Egon has suffered the same injury as Bayle by having his left leg torn off. They are mirrors of one another, highlighting the fact that the same rage and penchant for destruction that is present in Bayle is also present in humanity. And while Egon failed to defeat Bayle himself, he sees potential in us as we slay 2 Jagged Peak drakes, found on a plateau midway up the mountain. Here, he offers us his finger. Fingers, as we know, have a unique ability to join worlds, and thus he bids us to summon him when we face the dread. Egon's rage persists beyond his broken mortal form. When we summon him at the peak's prime, Egon emerges and unleashes his fury upon the Drake King.
Curse you, Bayle! I hereby vow you will rue this day. Behold, a true Drake warrior, and I, Egon, your fears made flesh. Solid of scale you might be, foul dragon, and I will riddle with holes your rotten hide. With a hail of harpoons! With every last drop of my being! Bayle, you shall know fear yet. Bayle the Dread, you shall haunt me no longer.
As Egan riddles Bayle's rotten hide with a hail of harpoons, the Tarnished takes the blessing of the Dragon Lord. Together, we withstand the overwhelming power of Bayle's second stage, in which he turns the arena into a storm of lightning and fire. He has long gotten used to his shattered body and now wields his sharpened, broken bones as weapons and conduits for his lightning attacks. Most impressive is his ability to focus his lightning mastery into replacement wings, taking to the skies and bombarding us with power that is only rivaled by Placidusax. Despite that, the fury of Egon and the determination of the Tarnished wins through, and we strike the Dread down and end his tyranny. Bayle will haunt Egan's dreams no longer, and he passes on, victorious in his ultimate aim. We can return to the Dragon Priestess and engage in the ultimate act of Dragon Communion by devouring Bayle's heart. Dragon Communion is always destructive, but eating the heart of the Dread Tyrant seems even more so, as the description of Bayle's heart tells us that even after being consumed, Bayle's spirit resists its subjugation, and one day, it will burn the Tarnished inside out. Until then, Bayle's awesome power is ours, and now, we need only consider Florisax herself. If we don't put her to sleep, her work is done, and it seems as though she dies, as only her heart and weapon remain. However, should we make her break her oath to her master, then she feels like we owe her something. We owe her a new lord. We stripped her of her lord, and now she is bereft of honor. With no lord, she thus surrenders her flesh and joins us as a spirit ash, servant to a new lord, so that she might regain her honor. Sadder still is the item description of her dragon bolt, which reads the following: "There was a time when the priestess never knew love, and thus never used this incantation herself. Florisax has given everything for others, namely her lord, Placidusax. She surrendered her dragon form, her sleep, and even her chance for love. She became lonely, a dragon separated from her kin in form and in distance, and not quite human either. Either way, her ending is a sad one, but at the very least, she can complete her mission and oversee Bayle's final and ultimate defeat. And perhaps she can find new purpose and a sense of honor in serving a new Elden Lord. And so, the great Primordial Schism finds its conclusion not in a clash of titans, but in the hands of lesser beings, of mortals who were once mere pawns in a divine war. The tale of Bayle and Placidusax, I believe, is a tragedy of pride and a testament to the furious, beautiful, and terrifying power of mortality. Placidusax, the embodiment of static, eternal order, sits broken and alone in a place beyond time, forever awaiting a god who has long abandoned him. Bayle, the avatar of chaotic, fleshy life, is finally brought low, his long rebellion ended. In their mutual hatred, they set in motion a chain of events that led to the decline of their entire species. What remains is the aftermath, the drakes, their wild and untamed legacy, and humanity, forever changed by the taste of a dragon's heart. The echoes of their war will shape the ages to come, a reminder that even in a world of gods and monsters, the most potent forces are often the most human: rage, ambition, and the unyielding will to endure. And that is it for the video. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe.